Mrs. Borison here. I get to share Civil War medicine and nursing with you today. Oh, you are in for a treat. So glad you decided to join us today. You see, Miss Kadonsky wanted us to dress up for this presentation. You know how passionate she is about her history. Well, it turns out that all of my Civil War dresses are at school, but I didn't want to be the only one not dressed up for the occasion. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. Turns out my husband is a graphic designer. He's not working right now and just looking for something fun and artistic to do. So he photoshopped my face onto a Civil War nurse's body. Ta-da! Can you tell that's me? I don't hardly recognize myself. I think my husband did a great job, but I also think I look creepy. As it turns out, I happened to pick a picture of a Wisconsin Civil War nurse. There's a happy accident for you. The photo was originally one of Harriet Douglas Wheaton. Hope I'm saying that right. Here's the real picture here. She volunteered as a nurse during the Civil War, and she served on hospital ships out of New York and Philadelphia from 1862 to 1865. Later, she was a nurse superintendent at the Carver Hospital in Washington, D.C., according to the Wisconsin Historical Society's website, wisconsinhistory.org. But today, I'll start sharing Civil War medicine with you by showing you the culprit of a great deal of pain and misery for soldiers on the battlefield, the lead mini ball. Here it is. Here's a picture of one. This one has not been shot out of a gun. You can tell because when they get shot out of a gun, the lead is such a soft metal that it would get deformed and look a lot more smushed or misshapen, especially after hitting something. Getting hit with a lead mini ball meant that now germs would enter the body with the bullet. If it hit the bone, it would shatter it. During Civil War time, they had no knowledge of germs causing infections. If a soldier was hit with one of these in the head or chest or abdomen, most of the time that meant they would not make it. If they got hit in the arms or legs, it would often mean amputation in order to prevent infection. And most soldiers could survive amputation surgeries. Amputation means cutting off a body part. We're getting into some of the gorier parts of history today. Here's an example of a soldier who was shot in the leg, so they amputated or cut off his leg. And later on, they fit him with a prosthetic leg or an artificial limb. If they didn't do these amputation surgeries, infection could set in. Something known as gangrene, which is where your skin or your body part starts to die. This is caused by infection or lack of blood flow. This gangrene would settle in if they didn't amputate, and it could kill the soldier. So to avoid this, they would perform amputation surgeries to try to stay ahead of the infection. 75% of the time this worked, even under very unsanitary conditions. Some soldiers still would get infections or gangrene even after the amputation surgery, and would have to be amputated on again. Here's an amputation kit from a surgeon. These amputation surgeries were performed as soon as possible, quickly. If they could amputate someone within 48 hours of being injured, there was only a 25% mortality rate. Sometimes they would perform these surgeries near the battlefield. Here's a field hospital that's set up with tents near Petersburg, Virginia. Sometimes in the outdoors even, so they'd have better light versus inside of a tent. They could amputate a knee in 3 minutes. But sanitary conditions for surgeries were not like what they are today. The doctors didn't wash their hands between patients. They would use the same surgical tools on multiple soldiers without sterilizing them in between. They didn't have anesthesia like today. To put a person under for surgery, they would use chloroform or ether. They used morphine and opium as painkillers. Today we know these to be highly addictive, so it's no surprise that Civil War soldiers became addicted to these painkillers. And it was always the Confederates that would run low on supplies. So it was the same with medical supplies. Over 30,000 amputations were done on Union soldiers, and the numbers were probably the same for the Confederate soldiers. Only sometimes they would go through these surgeries without chloroform to put them out, or without pain medicine for after the surgery. So disease was the greatest killer of the war. Not being shot, not bullets. I know big deadly battles like Gettysburg or single bloodiest day like Antietam make it seem like soldiers killing each other was probably the way they all died. But really, for every soldier who died on the battlefield, 2 soldiers died of disease. About half of the deaths from disease were caused by intestinal disorders, mainly typhoid fever, diarrhea, and dysentery. Dysentery is like really bad diarrhea, like bloody mucousy diarrhea, and you can die from it. The remainder died from pneumonia and tuberculosis. There were outbreaks of measles, chickenpox, mumps, and whooping cough. The Union Army reported that more than 995 out of every 1,000 men eventually contracted chronic diarrhea or dysentery during the war, and it was no better on the side of the Confederates. So pretty much if you signed up to fight in the Civil War, you were signing up for diarrhea or worse. And these diseases spread so quickly because the camps oftentimes were so unsanitary, especially more in the beginning of the war. They tend to get better as time goes on, but at the beginning, they were described as being littered with refuse, food, and other rubbish, slops deposited in pits within the camp limits, heaps of manure close to the camp. They hadn't figured out things like putting your water supply away from your bathrooms. But it gets better as time goes on. So next, we will talk about nursing during the Civil War. About 5,000 Northern and Southern women served as volunteer nurses during the Civil War. We have very few records from these nurses, as the work they did was very demanding, and it left them with little time for anything else. They spent their time changing bandages, feeding soldiers, consoling soldiers, maybe writing letters, reading letters from home, or helping them write or send letters to their homes, reading books, talking to them. Most nurses were not paid. So when we say volunteering, I don't want you to think of volunteering like it is today, where you might go work for a couple of hours or the afternoon. It was more like a full-time job, oftentimes with overtime hours, round-the-clock work. You work all day until you're exhausted, and then you go to sleep, and then you wake up and you start it all over again. Many women volunteered at local hospitals, and some went to the battlefields and then served in the field hospitals as well. Nurses didn't dress for comfort back then, no scrubs. It was full-on dress mode, all the way up to the neck, long sleeves, down to the floor. Hot and uncomfortable for sure. Here's a picture from the Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C. It was one of the largest hospitals in the area. It had 1,000 beds filled with wounded from the battlefields of Virginia. Many women left their homes and volunteered to help here and in places similar. We'll end with a few slides on Clara Barton. She was born in Massachusetts. She became famous thanks to her nursing efforts during the Civil War. She never had any formal nurse's training. She started out as a teacher, taught for 12 years. But then she started doing nursing work all on her own as a freelance frontline nurse. She'd help collect medical supplies, food, clothing. She started this early on with the beginning of the war in 1861. She would store and distribute medical supplies. She'd put ads in the paper asking people to send her medical supplies, and then she would take them directly to the battlefield. She was at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg. She would distribute medical supplies, clean field hospitals, apply bandages, feed soldiers. She earned the nickname Angel of the Battlefield. One time she was so involved in the battlefield that a bullet went through the sleeve of her dress without hitting her, but then it killed the man that she was working on. She even tended to the wounded after the failed assault on Fort Wagner, where the Massachusetts 54th led the attack. After the Civil War, she went on to found the American Red Cross in 1881. The Red Cross sounds familiar. It's because it's still around today. It's a humanitarian organization that provides emergency assistance and disaster relief. They're often the first volunteers to help out after a hurricane, tornadoes, natural disasters. Clara Barton led the Red Cross for 23 years. She was the first president. She was volunteering well into her 80s, helping out at hurricanes and floods. Up next, you'll hear from Ms. Kadonsky with Women on the Home Front. That's all for me for now. Bye, guys.